If you put Paraguay into Google, you'll find pictures of colonial churches, colorful embroidery, typical foods such as chipa and cold terere, as well as tempting shopping tourism offers. Everything seems peaceful, a cheap and friendly destination in South America. But that tranquility is just the facade. Behind the hospitality and traditions lies a country marked by corruption, extreme poverty, drug trafficking, and a silent violence that most tourists have no idea about. Inequality is growing, slums are multiplying, children are working to get an education, and a simple number, 108, has become a code of hatred against the LGBT population. And it doesn't stop there. The legacy of one of Latin America's most brutal regimes still echoes in the streets, while criminal factions expand their dominance by leaps and bounds. Today, we're going to delve into the dark side of Paraguay, the one that nobody puts in the tourist guides. Number 1. Location and geographical data. Paraguay is located in the middle of South America, landlocked and surrounded by Brazil, Argentina, and Bolivia. But this strategic position is not just a geographical detail. It has turned the country into one of the biggest crime corridors in the region. Its waterways are true arteries for drug trafficking, transporting drugs and weapons to supply Brazil, Argentina, and even Europe. Paraguayan territory is divided into two extremes. In the north, the Paraguayan Chaco, a green desert ranging from dense forests to arid plains, has become a lawless land. It has attracted millionaire landowners, foreign religious sects, and, according to investigations, even cocaine cartels. One of the most bizarre cases was that of Reverend Moon, a Korean religious leader who bought vast tracts of land there and, unwittingly or not, ended up giving way to clandestine airstrips used by drug traffickers. In the southeast, agribusiness dominates without break. Paraguay has become one of South America's largest exporters of soy and meat, enriching foreign businessmen and investors. But this prosperity doesn't come to everyone. Small farmers and indigenous communities are pushed into poverty, while the agribusiness giants take over everything. This social chasm is even wider between the larger cities and the rest of the country. Asunción, Encarnación, and Ciudad del Este try to look modern, with shopping malls and skyscrapers. But you only have to leave the urban circuit to find bumpy roads, hospitals with no structure, and abandoned schools. Any heavy rain turns into chaos, and thousands of families lose what little they have. And as if inequality weren't enough, Paraguay has become a veritable paradise for criminal gangs. In recent years, Brazilian and international groups have taken over the region, using the waterways and open borders to smuggle in cocaine, marijuana, and weapons. The Paraguay and Paraná rivers, which should be driving the economy, are now the main routes for crime. Paraguay may not have an outlet to the sea, but it has open doors for drug trafficking, and no one seems willing to close them. Number 2. A bit of history. Like its geography, Paraguay's history is also marked by extremes. Brutal dictatorship, ruthless repression, and a corruption that has never left the scene. The country spent 35 years under the iron fist of Alfredo Stroessner in what was the longest dictatorship in South America. It was a real nightmare. Political opponents simply disappeared, censorship crushed any criticism, and corruption became the norm in the government. To this day, many Paraguayans avoid talking about it, as if the ghost of Stroessner still haunts the country's streets. But political repression wasn't the only tragedy. The indigenous peoples paid an even higher price. In the Chaco, tribes such as the Guarani, Aché, and Ayoreo were forcibly removed from their lands. Entire communities simply disappeared, victims of massacres, forced displacement, and cultural destruction. Researchers have no doubt it was genocide. Documents show that villages were wiped off the map, that indigenous people were hunted like animals and sold as slave labor to farms. And we'll talk about this in more detail later. And the most bizarre thing, while this was going on, the Stroessner government was receiving millions of dollars from foreign powers under the pretext of modernizing the country. But in practice, this money supported a system of oppression and enriched the elite allied to the dictator. While the powerful lived in mansions and controlled everything, the people lived under constant surveillance and fear. The long-awaited freedom only arrived in 1989 with the end of the dictatorship. But those who hoped for a new era of prosperity saw the same old faces in power, maintaining the same dirty schemes. Many of today's politicians are sons or allies of the regime's former bosses, keeping the game going. What's worse, despite the economic growth driven by agribusiness, this wealth is still concentrated in the hands of a few. Foreign businessmen make a fortune from soy and cattle, while peasants and indigenous people continue to lack land, water, and basic services. Inequality has never been corrected, only made up. Stroessner may have left the scene, but his dark legacy lives on. Number 3. Social inequality and abandonment. If you only look at the statistics, you might think that Paraguay is an example of economic growth. Over the last 2 decades, the country has shown rates of expansion that have caught the attention of international organizations. But in practice, this economic boom has not reached the majority of the population. Around a quarter of Paraguayans live below the poverty line. In some rural regions, the figure is over 30%. In the Chaco, or on the outskirts of Asunción, the reality is cruel. Bumpy roads, schools falling apart, and hospitals without medicines. In many villages, all it takes is a heavy rain for everything to turn to mud and misery. And the problem goes further. Informality dominates the job market. Almost 2/3 of the economically active population have no labor protection. No formal contract, no pension, no guarantees. A health problem, an accident, or an economic crisis, and the person simply loses everything. Meanwhile, on the other side of the coin, Paraguay's elites live in another world. Large landowners, agribusiness entrepreneurs, and foreign investors buy up huge tracts of land to plant soybeans or raise cattle. The government encourages these activities, but completely ignores the millions of Paraguayans who live in overcrowded neighborhoods and slums where survival is a daily challenge. This brutal inequality is reflected in everything: access to education, life expectancy, and even urban violence, which grows as the state fails to provide opportunities for the poorest. In other words, a daily battleground for survival. Number 4. Indigenous peoples and the forgotten genocide. Although Paraguay was named after the Guarani culture, the reality of the country's indigenous peoples is one of the most tragic in the region. Today, there are 19 recognized ethnic groups in the country, but the majority live in miserable conditions. There is a lack of land, sanitation, and food. The persecution that began centuries ago hasn't ended. It's just changed form. During the Stroessner dictatorship, the massacre was explicit. Entire peoples were expelled from their lands. The Aché, for example, were literally hunted down. Historical accounts tell us that indigenous people were killed to make way for agribusiness, and the survivors sold as slaves to work on farms. Time has passed, but the situation remains tragic. In recent years, several indigenous leaders have been killed for trying to claim ancestral territories. Human rights groups denounce the total neglect of the government, which to this day has not fully complied with the ILO's Convention 169, an international agreement that guarantees indigenous peoples' right to land. The result? More and more indigenous communities are being pushed into urban centers. where they end up living in slums or being exploited as cheap labor. Many are recruited by criminal gangs to work in marijuana or cocaine plantations. Others are victims of alcoholism and drug trafficking, easy prey for a system that has simply abandoned them. And the most shocking thing, this silent genocide rarely makes the news. The world sees Paraguay only as a cheap shopping destination and soy exporter. Meanwhile, indigenous culture dissolves, forgotten in dark alleys, in precarious shacks and on land that was once theirs. Number 5. The growth of the favelas. Speaking of slums, when you talk about slums in South America, everyone immediately thinks of Brazil or, at most, neighborhoods in Argentina. But Paraguay also has its own housing crisis, and it's only growing unchecked. In Asunción, you only have to leave the more touristy areas to find a very different scenario. Entire neighborhoods taken over by precarious housing, streets with no infrastructure, and disorderly growth that is only getting worse. Among these communities, the most emblematic is Chacarita. The irony? Chacarita has two faces. On the one hand, it is a maze of wooden houses, flooded alleys, and families living on the edge of poverty. But on the other, the neighborhood has also become an alternative tourist spot, with colorful murals, craft fairs, and even bars selling the idea of an authentic Paraguay. Some guides take tourists to taste typical food and explore the decorated alleys, trying to turn the chaos into something sellable. But you only have to look a little deeper to see that the reality is far from pretty. The residents' biggest nightmare is the Paraguay River, which frequently overflows and invades their homes. When this happens, thousands of families simply lose everything. Some have to move temporarily to squares and high ground, waiting for the water to recede. Then they return to their homes full of mud and damp, destroying what little they have. The number of people living in these settlements has doubled in 2 decades. With the lack of affordable housing and the exodus of peasants driven out by agribusiness, urban slums are only growing. The scene? Improvised houses, streets without sanitation, open sewers, accumulated garbage, and, of course, violence. Gangs control many of these areas. Some are local, others have direct links to criminal factions in Brazil, such as the PCC or Comando Vermelho. The police make occasional raids, but on a day-to-day basis, it's the crime bosses who make the rules. Number 6. Children forced to work to study. In the popular imagination, childhood is a time for playing, learning, and enjoying family life. But in Paraguay, thousands of girls and boys face a harsh reality. They work without pay, or for spare change, in exchange for housing and the promise of attending school. This practice is known as criadazgo. In theory, criadazgo works like an agreement. Poor families, usually rural, send their children to live with wealthier families, believing that, in exchange for domestic services, they will have food, shelter, and access to school. In practice, these children become modern-day slaves, exploited without any protection. The majority are girls, and many of them start working at the age of 7 or 8. At dawn, they are already up and about, washing dishes, cooking, cleaning, and looking after their employer's children. School? They only go when there's time, and when their adoptive family allows it. To make matters worse, many suffer physical and psychological violence, and in some cases, even worse abuse. As they come from extremely poor families, they have nowhere to run. Some flee to the streets, where they fall into child prostitution or drug trafficking. Others can't even escape. One of the most shocking cases was that of Carolina Marine, a 14-year-old girl who left the countryside to live with a wealthy family, believing she would be able to study. Instead, she was enslaved, beaten, and, in January 2006, died after being brutally assaulted by her employers. The crime sparked protests, and the Paraguayan press began to pay more attention to the problem. But the truth is that this practice continues unabated. It is estimated that more than 40,000 children live under this regime in the country. The most revolting thing. Many of these agreements are made publicly. On social media, it's not hard to find disguised ads like looking for a girl to look after a child in exchange for food and housing. No salary, no contract, no rights. And so the cycle of poverty repeats itself. These children grow up without real access to education, without opportunities, and end up trapped in a life of exploitation. Number 7. Cartels and organized crime. In recent years, Paraguay has gone from being just a transit point to one of the main centers of organized crime in South America. The country has entered the radar of international cartels, becoming a key player in drug trafficking, arms smuggling, and money laundering. If before crime operated in the shadows, now it acts almost without fear. Geography has facilitated the chaos. Paraguay, with no sea and no large mountain ranges to hinder movement, is cut off by strategic rivers and wide-open borders. This has created the perfect route for the cartels. Cocaine from Peru and Bolivia arrives in clandestine planes that land on farms in the Chaco or on hidden airstrips in the middle of the forest. From there, it makes its way along the waterways of the Paraná River to Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. The First Capital Command, PCC, Brazil's largest criminal faction, has found Paraguay to be a veritable paradise for its operations. The faction's influence is so strong that Paraguayan prisons already serve as PCC offices, where new members are recruited. Organized crime has even infiltrated community radio stations, where the faction's supposed baptisms have been broadcast, as if it were the most normal thing in the world. And it doesn't stop there. The smuggling of illegal cigarettes is also worth billions. It is estimated that 70% of the illegal cigarettes consumed in Brazil come from Paraguay. Who controls this industry? Paraguayan companies, some directly linked to influential politicians. The definitive wake-up call came in 2022 when prosecutor Marcelo Pecci, who was investigating drug trafficking and money laundering, was murdered while on his honeymoon in Colombia. This made it clear that in Paraguay, those who stand up to organized crime are short-lived. The government pretends to be fighting crime, but the truth is that drug trafficking has become one of the engines of the economy. Number 8. Homophobia and the number 108. If corruption and organized crime are eating away at Paraguay's economy, homophobia is wreaking havoc on the social front. The country has one of the most backward laws in South America in terms of LGBT rights. There is no equal marriage, no national law on gender identity, and no consistent protection against hate crimes. Worse, discrimination is so culturally ingrained that the number 108 has become a common insult to refer to gays, lesbians, bisexuals, and trans people. This history of the number 108 dates back to the 50s, under the Stroessner regime, when 108 men, or those suspected of being gay, were persecuted and imprisoned on unfounded charges. Many were tortured and humiliated. Since then, the number has become synonymous with mockery and exclusion. Today, nobody wants the number 108 on license plates, addresses, or even official documents. One Paraguayan senator even demanded that his office not have the number on the door, so as not to be associated with the LGBT community. The result of this culture of hate? Young LGBT people face bullying, violence, and exclusion. Many flee the country, seeking refuge in Argentina or Brazil because they simply can't live in peace in Paraguay. Equal marriage? No way. Laws against hate crimes? Non-existent. Whenever someone tries to propose something, Congress blocks any progress with speeches defending morality. Paraguay is trapped in a bubble of backwardness where prejudice is still official, and for many, being gay still means living in hiding and fear. Number 9. Current conflicts and uncertain future. In the recent elections, much was said about economic growth, but little was discussed in depth about how to solve structural problems such as poverty, poor education, lack of sanitation, and the robust presence of organized crime. Elections come and go, but nothing really changes. Politicians talk about attracting investors, but ignore the growing poverty, urban violence, and precarious infrastructure. For many Paraguayans, the only solution is to flee. Young people migrate to Argentina, Brazil, Spain, and the United States in search of a decent life. And those who stay? The reality is harsh. Slums grow, indigenous communities continue to be ignored, and organized crime gains more territory. While the government tries to sell the image of a modern Paraguay, the country's shadows continue to grow denser. Paraguay's future is at stake. If something doesn't change soon, the country risks becoming a narco-state, where real power no longer lies with the government, but in the hands of cartels, factions, and corrupt individuals who control everything from behind the scenes. Paraguay is on the brink, and the question remains, until when? If you've made it this far, you've realized that Paraguay goes far beyond the shopping in Ciudad del Este or the cold tereré in the late afternoon. Now we want to know, which of these realities shocked you the most? Leave a comment and share this content so that more people can get to know this other side of South America. If you liked this content, share it with your friends who love curious stories, and don't forget to follow Bello Mundo for more adventures and unusual places. Thank you very much for being with us so far, and see you next time.